All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome on in. Welcome on in. We'll just take a few minutes, let people get into the live, and then we will get started. All right. Looks like folks are joining us from Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, all the good stuff.
Excellent.
All right. Give it just a few more seconds, and then we will get started. All right. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Red Hill Rediscovered. My name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the Director of Historic Preservation and Collections at Patrick Henry's Red Hill in Brookneal. And thank you to everyone who's joining us through our social media platforms today. We're very excited for today's presentation. And speaking of today's presentation, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Ragosta. John Ragosta is a historian at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, has taught law and history at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, and Hamilton, Oberlin, and Randolph Colleges. Dr. Ragosta's most recent book, For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle, which we're going to be talking about today, was released in August of 2023 by the University of Virginia Press. He's also the author of Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Legacy, America's Creed, published in 2013, and several other books. An award-winning author and frequent commentator, Ragosta holds both a PhD and a JD from the University of Virginia. And before returning to academia, Dr. Ragosta was a partner at Dewey Ballantine LLP. And a fun fact, he is also a beekeeper, which I'm very jealous of because I don't think I could ever do that. And with that, John, I will turn it over to you.
Cody, thank you so much. And thank you to Cody and Hope Marston, all the people at Red Hill who put on so many wonderful programs, which we really appreciate, and how important it is to have access to these programs. And I'm particularly happy that all of you are here today because I think this is a story that people need to know about. And it's a story about Patrick Henry and the hyper-partisanship of the 1790s that almost destroyed the country. And it also suggests that maybe Patrick Henry is more important than we've been led to believe to some extent. But I want to start you where I started this story. I came across a fascinating letter. It's January 15th, 1799 at Mount Vernon. George Washington is living in retirement under his own vine and fig tree, to use one of his favorite biblical allusions. It's a very mild and sunny day outside. But inside Mount Vernon, it's becoming very stormy. You can almost sense the general pacing the wide pine boards of Mount Vernon as his anger rises. And finally, George Washington, the man we know of as the sword of the American Revolution, sits down at his desk in his study, picks up a sheaf of paper and a quill pen, and he decides to write a letter to a man we know of as the trumpet of the American Revolution, Patrick Henry. Now, they had not communicated for many years, but at this particular moment, Washington writes Henry that a crisis exists when everything dear and valuable to us is assailed. Washington goes on to rail at some people who are putting their own personal political ambitions above the country and threatening the crisis in the country itself. Measures are systematically and pertinaciously pursued, which must eventually dissolve the Union or produce coercion. And by coercion, George Washington meant the U.S. Army marching on its own citizens. The nation was at risk. There was a possibility of civil war, and George Washington asked Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to help save the Union. Now, Patrick Henry was living in retirement as well at Red Hill. He had been offered multiple positions. They had wanted him to be Supreme Court Justice. They had wanted him to be Secretary of State, Senator, Governor, Ambassador to France and Spain. He had always declined those possibilities. He said that he would only come out of retirement if the nation itself faced the horrors of anarchy. Well, when he gets George Washington's letter in February of 1799, he writes back, "I accord with every sentiment you express to me." Patrick Henry now agrees to come out of retirement at George Washington's behest. So who was it that was causing the problem? Who was it that was putting their own personal political ambition above the country's interests and threatening disunion? Well, it was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the radical states' rights agenda of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Now, Patrick Henry wins his election. Patrick Henry always wins his elections. But he dies before he can take office. People wrote at the time, and I argue, that had Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson almost certainly would not have been elected president in 1800. Well, this was a fascinating story. It was a story that I was unaware of until I had read this letter. Here is the sword of the American Revolution and the trumpet of the American Revolution against the pen of the American Revolution and the father of the Constitution. Well, what was this story all about? And what I decided was I wanted to know three things. I wanted to know first, what was going on with Henry? Why was Patrick Henry, the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, opposing states' rights? And what about Jefferson? If it's true that Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected president, is this story telling us something about Thomas Jefferson that we should understand? And then the third issue, particularly interested in talking to a crowd from Red Hill, why is this not a bigger part of history? Is it forgetfulness, or is something else going on that we haven't given Patrick Henry his real due in all of these issues? So those were the issues I wanted to look into. And I needed to start in the summer of 1798 and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, how did we get there? George Washington, of course, is inaugurated president in 1789. We almost immediately have the French Revolution, and there's going to be wars between Britain and France almost constantly until 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. And George Washington decides that the United States is too weak to be pulled into those wars. Britain wants us on their side. France wants us on their side. And Washington says, no, we're going to remain neutral. The Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. In 1795, Washington enters into the Jay Treaty with Britain. It's not a very good treaty, but it keeps the peace with Britain. So by the time we got to 1798, the immediate threat was France and a rising Napoleon Bonaparte. The United States had sent peace negotiators to France, but our negotiators were met with a demand from the French foreign minister that they pay a bribe even to meet with the foreign minister. You can see in this slide the idea of France plundering America. And this was an insult to the United States. We wouldn't pay that kind of a bribe. You know, millions for defense, not one penny for tribute, became the rallying cry. And so we ended up in a quasi-war with France. It wasn't a declared war. It's called a quasi-war, but it was a real war. Ships were shooting each other. People were being killed. France seized over 330 American ships in the so-called quasi-war. Insurance rates skyrocketed. People were really concerned that we were going to have a war and Napoleon Bonaparte's armies were going to invade America. So the Federalists, the party of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, the party which controlled both Congress and the presidency, decided to do three things. First, they increased the defense budget. They said, if we do get pulled into a war, we better have a better Navy and a better Army. Second, they adopted the Alien Acts. And these alien acts were not really enforced, but the idea was that if we entered into a war, the president could deport any alien who he thought was a possible danger. No trial, no due process. But the third thing, the most ominous thing, was the Congress and the president adopted the Sedition Acts. Now, the Sedition Act literally made it illegal to criticize the president or the Congress of the United States. Oh, by the way, you can say whatever you want about the vice president. Vice president's Thomas Jefferson. But it's illegal to criticize the president or Congress. Now, historians told us for many years that there were 14 prosecutions, 10 people were fined or imprisoned under the Sedition Act. More recent research has shown that's grossly underestimated. There were over 40 indictments, over 120 persons, and critically, they were targeting the opposition newspapers. The Federalists in control of the presidency were targeting opposition newspaper editors and throwing them in jail. Thomas Jefferson said it's a reign of witches. He writes to one supporter that if the newspapers fail, republicanism will be entirely browbeaten. He writes to another that to preserve freedom of the press, every spirit should be ready to devote itself to martyrdom. To martyrdom. So this is a reign of witches, and it is a very serious crisis. But slightly ahead of myself, but the question was, what were the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, what were they supposed to do? Your newspaper editors are being thrown in jail. Well, the first thing you would normally do in these circumstances is you win the next election. You throw the bums out. You change the laws, right? But there was a problem with that. First of all, because of that XYZ affair, you remember France had demanded a bribe. John Adams, President John Adams, is actually popular for the first and probably only time in his life. He's taken to going to events wearing a sword because the United States was going to be at war and he was going to be the commander in chief. So we're not sure if we can win an election. And add to that the Sedition Act. If they're going to throw in jail newspaper editors and even people who were erecting liberty poles supporting the Democratic Republic and Jeffersonians, how can you have a fair election? This particular liberty pole has signs on it: no Sedition Act, peace and retirement to the president. Now, do we want John Adams to go into retirement? So what were you supposed to do? That wouldn't work. So if the election won't work, your second option, well, you sue. The Sedition Act is a violation of the First Amendment. It's a violation of freedom of the press, freedom of speech. So you sue. You get the law thrown out as unconstitutional. And even though this was a few years before Marbury versus Madison, they knew that the Supreme Court could throw out an unconstitutional law. Jefferson had said that. James Madison had said that. But there was a problem. All of the Supreme Court justices are Federalists. They've been appointed by George Washington or John Adams. We don't have 200 years of an independent judiciary. And 5 of the 6 Supreme Court justices had sat on Sedition Act cases when they were riding circuit around the country and never said anything about it being unconstitutional. And if you brought a case and the Supreme Court said that the law was constitutional, well, then you're worse off. So what do you do? What do you do if you're Jefferson? Well, he settled on a third option. And that was he wanted to enlist the states to help push back against the federal government, against an unconstitutional act. Now, this had been done before. In fact, Patrick Henry had led the effort in Virginia in 1791 to oppose Alexander Hamilton's financial system because they thought it was unconstitutional. And they had registered with the Congress an objection that this law should be repealed. But Jefferson thought that's not enough. We need to do much more than merely protesting. And so instead, Jefferson and Madison draft the Kentucky and the Virginia resolutions. Now, the Kentucky resolutions were the strongest. They were drafted by Jefferson, and they're the ones that caused the most concern. First, Jefferson wrote that the United States was merely a compact of independent sovereign states. That was what the Confederation had been, the Confederation which had failed. But he now says that's what the United States is. If that's true, any state can secede from the Union. He also says that a state, an individual state, may nullify, that's Jefferson's term, it's a term you may have heard before, may nullify a federal law that it decides is unconstitutional. He writes in the Kentucky resolutions, those laws are null, void, of no force and effect. Now, if that's the case, we're going to have different federal law in different states. We're going to have states opposed to the federal government. And if the United States is merely a compact, that issue of succession becomes very real. Jefferson's talking about succession in 1799. He writes that determined were we to be disappointed in this repeal of the Alien and Sedition Acts, to sever ourselves from that union we so much value. Virginia is known to be buying arms, be buying thousands of muskets. People say it may be for a conflict with federal government. One Virginia militia official was quoted in the paper saying that if France invades the United States, he will take his troops to the French banner rather than the stars and stripes carried by a political opponent. Open treason. Newspapers had headlines all over the country saying civil war because of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Well, this was the crisis that George Washington and Patrick Henry saw. This is what caused George Washington to write Patrick Henry. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were a real crisis, but the Jeffersonian response created a new crisis. Well, as I said, Patrick Henry agreed to come out of retirement. But it's curious that it's Patrick Henry. Those listening today will remember that Patrick Henry was the leading anti-federalist in the ratification debates over the Constitution. He had urged Virginia not to adopt the U.S. Constitution. He said it was going to create a government that was too powerful, too distant from the people. But now he comes out of retirement to give his final political speech at Charlotte Courthouse to defend the Constitution that he had opposed. And again, some of you will know this is actually Charlotte Courthouse from the 19th century, ironically designed by Thomas Jefferson. The one that Patrick Henry was at was an earlier version. But on that particular morning, March 4th, 1799, Patrick Henry was sitting on a porch across from the courthouse at a tavern. It was said that he appeared weak, he appeared old. He had a gray Scottish cast about him. But when he rose to speak, people said a wonderful transformation came over Patrick Henry. He rose up to his full height. His voice boomed out. Thousands were gathered to hear him in what they knew would be his last political speech. And he sounded like the Patrick Henry of the Revolution. He told the people that the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions have planted thorns upon my pillow. Henry has a way with words. He reminds them, he says, Virginia is to the Union the same as Charlotte County is to Virginia. Virginia has no more right to ignore the laws of the federal government than Charlotte County has to ignore the laws of Virginia. Such opposition on the part of Virginia to the acts of the general government must beget their enforcement by military power, civil war, foreign alliances. He suggests that if Virginia continues down this route, they're going to face a federal army with George Washington at the head of the army. Who will dare to lift his hand against the father of his country, to point a weapon at the breast of a man who has often led them to battle and to victory? Well, it's an 18th century election, so people have been drinking. And there's a particular man in the audience. We know his name. It's John Harvey is the fellow. He's apparently a little drunk. And when Patrick Henry says, who will dare to raise his hand? John Harvey, I would. This was a huge mistake. Patrick Henry rises up to his height. He turns on him. He glares at him. You dare not do it. In such a parricidal attempt, the steel will drop from your nerveless arm. This is classic Henry. He goes on. If the administration has done wrong in the Alien and Sedition Acts, let us all go wrong together. United we stand, divided we fall. Is the federal government too powerful? It's necessary to submit to the constitutional exercise of that power. Go to the ballot box. Oppose the government in a constitutional way. Henry's phrase, in a constitutional way. He warns the people that if we can't live within the Constitution that we adopted, you may bid adieu forever to representative government. You can never exchange the present government but for a monarchy. I think what Henry is telling the crowd, and he reminds them of his opposition to the Constitution. And he says, I warned you. I warned you this was happening. I told you the government would be too powerful. I told you the government would interfere with your rights. But we agreed. I didn't agree. I opposed it. But we, the people, agreed to this Constitution. And if we can't live within this Constitution, the only option is a monarchy. Well, as I said, Patrick Henry won his election, but he died on June 6th, 1799, before he could take office. John Randolph of Roanoke, one of the leading Democratic Republicans, Jeffersonians at that time, says that had Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson would have never been president. Well, that leads us to the second question. So if that's what Henry's doing, it leads us to the second question. What about Jefferson? The normal history of this era says that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison draft the Kentucky and the Virginia resolutions, and then Jefferson wins the presidency in 1800, as if one follows from the other. But that's highly misleading. In fact, there was a midterm election. And in the midterm election, the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, take a complete thumping, especially in the South, because people thought they were threatening the Union with that radical states' rights agenda. In South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, those three states, the Deep South, had a total of 4 Federalist members of Congress after the 1799 elections, they had 12. Federalist majority in the Congress goes from 6 to 20. In Virginia, John Marshall is elected to the Congress as a Federalist with the assistance of Patrick Henry. Henry, Light Horse Harry Lee, another Thomas Jefferson opponent, is elected to the Congress with the support of Patrick Henry. Jefferson is shocked. He says the elections astonished everyone. Well, they astonished him. He says it's a taint in that part of the state which I had not expected. I've always wondered if in the years that follow, when Thomas Jefferson is fighting John Marshall as the Supreme Court Justice, whether he remembers that it was Patrick Henry that got John Marshall elected to Congress, which led John Adams to appointing him to the Supreme Court. But here's the interesting part. Jefferson and Madison seem to realize that they had gone too far. They do what we want politicians to do. They reconsidered whether they had made a mistake. Of course, they can't say they made a mistake. They're politicians. But they pull back from that agenda. I came across another fascinating letter. On December 29th, 1798, it's actually 8 days after the Virginia resolutions are adopted by the Virginia legislature. The Virginia resolutions that James Madison wrote, they're his resolutions, and they're far weaker than the Kentucky resolutions that Jefferson wrote. 8 days after those resolutions are adopted, Madison is writing Thomas Jefferson saying, perhaps we went too far. It is to be feared their zeal. He's accusing the Virginia legislature, never mind he's the one who wrote the resolutions. Their zeal may forget some considerations which ought to temper their proceedings. In the charge of usurpation, we are subject to the charge of usurpation in the very act of protesting against the usurpations of Congress. So we're complaining that Congress has exercised power it does not have under the First Amendment, but we're exercising power that the states don't have. And Jefferson and Madison reconsider, and they pull back very substantially. For example, in 1798, when the federal government is enforcing the Sedition Act, they were almost begging the federal government to prosecute somebody in the South, because all the prosecutions had been in Maryland and North. And they're saying, prosecute somebody in the South, because we won't tolerate it. We'll nullify those laws. In fact, in Virginia, there was a proposal to give state court judges, now think about this for a moment, state court judges the authority to issue habeas corpus against federal prisoners. So a federal marshal arrests somebody for violation of the Sedition Act, a federal court puts them in jail, and a state court would release them. Would have been a direct conflict. But by 1800, when James Callender, some of you may remember James Callender, he's going to be important for Jefferson later when he publicizes the Sally Hemings affair. James Callender is the first person indicted in the South in 1800. He's put in jail under the Sedition Act. And James Monroe, the new governor of Virginia at the time, writes Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, basically saying, don't do anything stupid. Let's not be rash. Let's let this law take its effect. Let's not talk about nullification. Let's not talk about states' rights. Let's focus on the real issue, which is the federal government is too powerful and it's violating the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. And that's what Jefferson and Madison do. And I think this is particularly clear with President Thomas Jefferson, because he does win the presidency in 1800. Henry's dead. George Washington dies in 1799. And Thomas Jefferson comes to the presidency. But it's a chastened Thomas Jefferson. For 200 years, people have accused Thomas Jefferson of hypocrisy as president, because he does not do as president the things that he said he would do in the 1790s. Well, I don't think it's necessarily hypocrisy. I think it's Jefferson understanding that the hyper-partisanship of the 1790s almost destroyed the nation. If you reread Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address with that thought in mind, it takes on a very different meaning. He's chastened. He talks about we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. What unites us is more important than what divides us. He says we must unite in common efforts for the common good. It seems that Jefferson is the first president that really understands that once elected, the US president must speak for the entire country. And that becomes a model for the US president for 2 centuries. Ironically, it's because Thomas Jefferson wins the presidency that the crisis that Henry and Washington were concerned about dissolves. Because if Jefferson had lost, then the Jeffersonians might have been forced to the radical arguments that they were making in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. But the crisis is gone. It dissipates. But then that leads us to the third question I had at the beginning, and an equally important question. What then of Patrick Henry? Why is it that we know so little of Patrick Henry if he was central to this crisis of union? After all, most people in America have heard of Patrick Henry, but if they know anything, all they remember is 7 words he mentioned at St. John's Church in Richmond: give me liberty or give me death. But he was far more important than that. He gave the first impulse to the ball of the revolution. It's not now easy to say what we should have done without Patrick Henry. Even Thomas Jefferson says that. He led opposition to the Stamp Act. Opposition was basically a dead letter until Patrick Henry gave his Caesar had his Brutus speech. He makes the liberty or death speech, calling people to arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? 4 weeks before Lexington and Concord. He becomes the first governor of the independent Virginia, the largest state by land, by population, by wealth. He's critical in getting supplies to Valley Forge. He's critical in defusing the Conway cabal, which sought to replace George Washington as commander-in-chief. He's central to getting George Rogers Clark material so he could go out to the Northwest Territories. He then becomes the leading anti-federalist in the battle over ratification. Many people say it's because of Patrick Henry we have a Bill of Rights, because the anti-federalists insisted that if we adopt this Constitution, we at least need to get a Bill of Rights. And his critique of the Constitution is very important to lawyers and judges today, the understanding what the Constitution means. And then in 1799, he defines what it means to be a loyal opposition. The idea that I, Patrick Henry, opposed the Constitution, but once we, the people, adopt it, I'm bound as well. We all have to support that Constitution. So why is Patrick Henry not better known? Well, I think there's several reasons for that. One is that Patrick Henry didn't seem to care so much about his legacy in many respects. I tell people Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, they all cared a lot about what you and I were going to think about them. They preserved their papers, they curated their papers, they thought that was very important. We, of course, don't have a lot of detail from Henry. And then it doesn't help that in opposing the Constitution, Henry had refused to take federal office. He was offered Secretary of State, Supreme Court, Senator, Ambassador to France and Spain, and he always said, no, I'm going to maintain myself in retirement. That certainly hurt his historic memory. But then there's a third reason, and I think it's critical. Patrick Henry is directly and viciously attacked by his political opponents for years, both before he dies and after he dies. It's said he's all tongue without either head or heart. What we have to do, I think, is devoutly pray for his death. He's avaricious and rotten-hearted. He read nothing. He had no books. He wrote almost nothing. He could not write. In his heart, he preferred low society. His legal reasoning is not worth a copper. George Wythe, the leading jurist in Virginia, absolutely refused to sign his law license. Patrick Henry had contempt and hatred for George Washington. All of these things were said by Thomas Jefferson. Now, many of them, and by the way, Jefferson's going to continue to say these things against Patrick Henry for 26 years after Patrick Henry's death. He's meeting with Daniel Webster. He's meeting with William Wirt. He's telling them that Patrick Henry, sure, he was a good speaker, but nothing else. Now, we know many of these criticisms are absolutely ridiculous. We know that, in fact, George Washington and Patrick Henry are great allies. The story I began this discussion with. We know that George Wythe does, in fact, sign Patrick Henry's license, because somebody in the 20th century found a copy of Patrick Henry's license in some county archives. So Jefferson's wrong about that. We know that Patrick Henry has a very good library by 18th century standard. It's not as good as Thomas Jefferson's, but he read Latin, he read some Greek. But these attacks on Patrick Henry's character, and on his ability, on his intelligence, on his political philosophy had an effect. For example, other Jeffersonians started to say that Patrick Henry was senile in 1799. He was jealous of Thomas Jefferson. Not exactly clear what he was jealous of. Said he was a religious fanatic. The Aurora, the leading Democratic Jeffersonian newspaper in 1799, in early 1799, published a story about Patrick Henry because John Adams had recommended Patrick Henry to be a new peace negotiator to France after the XYZ affair. At that time, in January of 1799, the Aurora says that Patrick Henry is venerable. His reputation is alike pure and his talents conspicuous. After that speech at Charlotte Courthouse, the Aurora has a different story. Patrick Henry is in the insuspicious temper of second childhood. It has made him a dupe. He drag his aged limbs and break his wind. He farted. They're telling fart jokes about Patrick Henry. And all of this is because of the Jeffersonians attacking Patrick Henry's character and his contributions to the country. Now, where is this coming from? It's not all the 1799 campaign. In fact, I would suggest it's primarily, and again, those on this call will be familiar with this, that when Jefferson was governor in 1781 in Virginia, and the Redcoats invaded and drove the government from Richmond to Charlottesville, and then from Charlottesville to Staunton, And Thomas Jefferson's term as governor was technically over, but the state had not appointed a new governor. But when the Redcoats drive the government from Charlottesville to Stanton, instead of going with the government to Stanton, Thomas Jefferson flees to his home near Lynchburg, Poplar Forest. When the government reconvenes in Stanton, they appoint a new governor, Thomas Nelson Jr., who's going to actually lead Virginia troops at the Battle of Yorktown. But they also launch an investigation of Jefferson's governorship, implying that he's a coward, that he's incompetent, and that he is engaged in dishonor. And that kind of an attack on honor is critically important. Jefferson writes to James Monroe, "The investigation inflicted a wound on my spirit, which will only be cured by the all-healing grave." Even for Thomas Jefferson, pretty broad terms. Now, by the way, historians disagree about whether or not Patrick Henry was behind that investigation. And the record's not perfectly clear. I think he probably was. I think Henry was probably outraged that it appeared the governor was abandoning the state. And Jefferson, although he can be prickly, it's hard to imagine he simply made this up. He's hearing from supporters in Stanton. John Taylor says that he could never forgive Patrick Henry for his conduct respecting Mr. Jefferson at Stanton. So I think Henry did launch that investigation. But after the Battle of Yorktown, it's clear we're going to win the Revolution. The Virginia legislature, including Patrick Henry, unanimously dismisses the investigation and thanks Jefferson for his service. But Jefferson could never get over it. For years thereafter, he is going to take every opportunity to minimize Patrick Henry's significance and to attack his character. He has to admit he's the greatest speaker ever. He says, "He seems to me to write as Homer, or he seems to me to speak as Homer wrote." He speaks as Homer wrote. But everything else about Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson's going to attack. Well, I've been talking for some time. You know, when you study history in graduate school, one of the classic question you get from your professor is, "So what?" It's an interesting story. George Washington writes Patrick Henry, "So what? Is there a significance to this?" Well, I think there's 4 particular important so whats about this story. First, it is about the centrality of a free press and newspapers. Thomas Jefferson was correct that if you allow a government in power to attack the editors of the newspapers, the media people who support the other side, it is a reign of witches. Dozens were indicted, they were jailed, and the country cannot work unless we have an active free press. Anyone that says the free press is the enemy of the American people is themselves an enemy of the American people. Second, so what? I think it's clear that even for Patrick Henry, the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, states' rights can go too far. That's certainly also an issue which we're actively discussing today. People are again talking about nullification, ignoring the history of nullification and how Jefferson and Madison pulled back, and then the idea of nullification years later explodes over Fort Sumter. Third, Henry is also right about the critical question of what do you do when you oppose government policy? What does it mean to be a loyal opposition? You go to the ballot box. We're all familiar with the Revolution of 1800, the peaceful change of parties, but it almost didn't happen. And that would have been terrible. You go to the ballot box when you disagree with the government. You don't ignore the laws. You don't ignore the election results because you don't think you can win the election. And fourth, so what in this story? And that is for us to remember that history is not simply lived, it's also written. And our remembered history may be a little different from what actually happened. The history in this case is written largely by the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans. Today, Patrick Henry, as I said, is remembered only for those 7 words in St. John's Church, give me liberty or give me death. He's become, in the popular imagination, a radical opponent of any government action. Liberty über alles, embraced by the modern Tea Party, by Clive Bundy and others, as if that was all that Patrick Henry had to say to the country. But in fact, that speech at Charlotte Courthouse is much better indication of Patrick Henry's intentions when he says, look, yes, I support liberty, but I also support the community, our right to govern ourselves, and the need for each of us to abide by the decisions of the government, even if we don't support them. Henry understood the first rule in a democracy is the majority rules. The second rule is equally important. The minority must accept the first rule. So I've been talking for a while. I hope you have a chance to read the book. I hope you enjoy it. I've been encouraging people, anyone who does read it, to please leave a review on Amazon. They apparently care about that. But with that, Cody, if you want to get rid of the slides, hopefully we'll have some questions from folks.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, John. I certainly appreciate it. I always love hearing about the interesting but often tense relationship between Jefferson and Madison and Henry. But I wonder if in the end, at least for some part, that wasn't a good thing in our eyes, because if it wasn't for those the bad historical reviews, we wouldn't get the personal anecdotes written by Samuel Meredith and Spencer Roane, who talk about Henry in ways that he never talked about himself.
Right, Cody, it's a very good point. And part of what you're saying, and it's so easy to forget, is, first of all, these people are people. We tend to think of them as these marble statues. And I got Thomas Jefferson, I got Patrick Henry, I got James Madison. Well, no, they're real people, and they have arguments, and they disagree with each other, and they have personal political vendettas. And the second part about that is they change over time. So I spend a lot of time with Thomas Jefferson, and people say, well, Jefferson said this, or he said that, or he did this. And I'll say, yeah, when? Because he's human, and Jefferson lives a lot longer than Patrick Henry does. Mm-hmm. And he changes over time. So yes, we get these very rich discussions of these people because Meredith understood, people understood at the time that, no, these are people, and he has no qualms about saying, look, Jefferson gets Henry wrong. Let me tell you about the real Patrick Henry. So yeah, it does give us a much, if we read the stuff and we go into it, we get a much richer, a much more human Patrick Henry, and for that matter, a much richer Thomas Jefferson. As I said, I did not expect, if I had finished this book 3 or 4 years earlier, Thomas Jefferson really would have come out much worse than he does as sort of the bad guy. I really developed over time, and this is something I think I'll be interested in what academics say about it, which is really new, that no, Jefferson really is pulling back here. He's really reconsidering that, no, we went too far. And that letter I read from Madison was just a revelation to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, this actually touches on our first question here from Lucia, where she asks, how did Jefferson and Madison feel about Henry speaking out against them?
Well, they weren't fond of it. The interesting thing is they have an ongoing, as Cody's comment had implied, they had an ongoing relationship for many, many years, is the other thing about them being people. Thomas Jefferson meets James Madison in 1776 in the Virginia House of Delegates when they're working on the issue of religious freedom and separation of church and state. James Madison then becomes a member of the governor's council under Governor Patrick Henry. Then you have Governor Thomas Jefferson. I'm trying to say there's a lot of interactions here. These people know each other. We then have Governor Thomas Jefferson. And by that point in time, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are sort of becoming best friends. And then we have, in the mid-1780s, Patrick Henry supports the idea of a government tax, a general assessment to support religious leaders, to support ministers. Madison and Jefferson are obviously opposed to that. So there's been a lot of interaction between these people. And long before 1799, Jefferson and Madison are no friends of Patrick Henry. Madison, of course, is always the more moderate of the two between Jefferson and Madison. And for example, during the ratification debates, it's Madison versus Henry at the Virginia ratification debates. But I think Madison also has a much greater appreciation for the important things that Henry says. So I'll give you an example. Madison, during the ratification debates, is opposed to a Bill of Rights. And Henry and George Mason keep saying, we need a Bill of Rights, we need a Bill of Rights. Madison saying, no, we don't need a Bill of Rights. After the Constitution was ratified, Madison, of course, becomes the major supporter of the Bill of Rights. And he says, he won't say, gee, I'm quoting Patrick Henry, but it's almost as if he's quoting Patrick Henry. He talks about the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, which gives the Congress and the federal government some authority to engage in powers that are not expressly listed in the Constitution. And James Madison turns to that and says, he won't say, maybe Patrick Henry was right, but he says, maybe we do need a Bill of Rights because the federal government's going to have these expansive powers. So, as I said, I think Jefferson's anger at Patrick Henry is much more personal, much more visceral because of that, that wound to my spirit, which will only be healed with the all-healing grave. I think Madison has much more of a political disagreement with him, and he understands Henry's contributions.
All right, well, thank you. And this next question is actually bringing in some more modern issues where Jeffrey asks, could you draw analogies to Henry's time in the late 1790s and the recent Supreme Court decision regarding removal of presidential candidates from state presidential primaries?
Oh, yeah, we could be here for a while. Yes and no. I do think, and I should start with, I think we have to be very careful about taking direct comparisons between the 1790s and today. I mean, the 1790s, yes, hyper-partisanship. Yes, the country was at risk. Yes, they didn't know what a democracy really meant. They didn't know about a loyal opposition, talking about states nullifying federal laws. And we have that going on today. Governor Abbott in Texas is basically talking nullification. And he should really read Patrick Henry. He should read my book because it's really a dangerous idea that Henry recognized as a bad idea. So I think we have to be careful about immediate comparisons. In terms of the Supreme Court's most recent decision, I think, and you've seen this all in the press, it's a great question, but it really wasn't that difficult a decision, and that's why it was unanimous, because the question is who gets to say what's an insurrection. The 14th Amendment's very clear. If you support an insurrection, you can't be a federal officer. But it can't be because Cody Youngblood says it was an insurrection or John Ragosta says it's an insurrection. And it can't be each individual state doing something separately. It has to be the federal government. So if Congress says January 6th was an insurrection, which they've never formally said, if they say that formally, well, then it's a different matter. So, one parallel there is the difference between states taking action versus the federal government taking action. Henry is a supporter of states' rights, but in certain circumstances, the federal government is the one that has to make the decision, has to have the power. And so I think that in this particular case, so imagine Henry's Virginia had banned Donald Trump from the ballot because he engaged in insurrection. I think Henry would be standing up saying, not so fast. This is a federal issue. So I think that parallel is an important one.
All right, well, thank you. This one is more of a comment, but I guess we could turn it into a question here. Danny asked, Patrick Henry was not an advocate of big government. That is why he has been buried in history. Do you agree with that? Disagree? What's your thoughts?
Well, a little bit. I mean, I do think the fact that he wouldn't take federal office is part of the reason why he's buried in history. But, because had he been Secretary of State, it was, we had a pattern going on. Secretaries of State were becoming president. In fact, there was an effort to enlist Patrick Henry as a vice presidential candidate in 1796 with John Adams as president, Patrick Henry as vice president. That would have been an unbeatable ticket. Nobody could beat a John Adams, Patrick Henry ticket. So, yeah, I think his saying, I'm not going to join the federal government. That's not what I'm about. You all created this powerful, large government. You all take care of it. I think that's part of it. I'm not so sure I would say simply big government versus little government, because you have an intervening civil war and the government gets bigger for lots of reasons. But I'll give you one example we didn't talk about, Cody, which is very interesting. I mentioned that Jeffersonians are trashing Patrick Henry's reputation for years after he's dead. One of the people that trashes his reputation is a gentleman named Edward Pollard. Now, again, a few people online may know who Edward Pollard is. Edward Pollard is an unrepentant Confederate officer who writes the infamous Lost Cause after the Civil War, saying the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. It was all about states' rights. Now, to write about that kind of thing, Edward Pollard, who's a huge supporter of Jefferson, because he says Jefferson was in favor of nullification, never mind that Jefferson pulled back from that position, but he also has to attack Patrick Henry. So Edward Pollard in the 1870s writes an extended essay trashing Patrick Henry's reputation and saying he's not a good politician, he doesn't know anything. He goes so far as to say Patrick Henry was not even a very good speaker, which is absurd. Everybody who ever heard Patrick Henry give a speech says he's the greatest speaker of all time, including Jefferson. But it's those attacks on Henry, because of his attack on the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, that I think really have an effect over time. Henry dies in 1799. Almost immediately, a resolution is introduced into the Virginia House of Delegates to put up a statue to Patrick Henry. Now, again, some people online may say, well, it's there now, but it was only put there later. The Jeffersonians block that statue going into the Virginia General Assembly because of this battle with Jefferson and the Jeffersonians. So anyway, there's a lot of reasons why Henry does not have the position in history that he really deserves.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Pollard speaking against Henry's speaking abilities. One of my favorite quotes is actually about Henry and his speaking abilities, and it was from a Supreme Court Justice, James Iredell, where he was, he heard a bit about Patrick Henry, and he wasn't really too excited about it. But when he sits before Patrick in the British debts case, he says, the famous 7 words, "Gracious God, he is an orator indeed." And I think
Iredell's a Federalist. And that was one of the reasons he was thinking in that partisan, Henry's on the other side. Or he's thinking Henry's on the states' rights, the Jeffersonian side, because as I said, Henry's really the intellectual godfather of that movement. And so Iredell's like, boy, my God, he really is a great speaker. So again, Henry deserves better than history has given him. But as I said, he's partially the cause of his own problem, because he was burning letters, we know that stuff.
Yeah, I do agree with you there. Well, one last question here before we finish up. This one's from Michael. Do you think the criticisms of Jefferson's governorship were justified?
Oh, Michael, that's a very good question. I think Jefferson wishes he could have done it again. And I'll say this, there's a really good book, by the way, on this by a gentleman named Michael Cranish. I think it's called Flight from Monticello. And it's about Jefferson's running when the British invaded and about the problems with his government. Excellent book. Michael Cranish is now, he's a journalist at the Washington Post. But he came here to Monticello to write that book, and it's an excellent book. I guess a couple observations. One of Jefferson's complaints was that the governor under the Virginia Constitution of 1776 was very weak. And so he couldn't do the things that he would have liked to have done to respond to the British invasion. Now, in fact, Henry had been a little bit more aggressive as governor, that when the legislature's not there, they couldn't meet. Henry says, we're in the midst of a war. I'm the governor. I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to do some things, and, we'll sort it out later. Jefferson seems to be a little bit less willing to do that. And so I think there's some criticism there. But in fairness to Jefferson, the governorship really was weak. And interestingly, after all of this happens, the investigation, and they finally then eliminate the investigation, and they vote Jefferson thanks. George Washington, interestingly, the commander-in-chief of the army, he's still the commander-in-chief. He writes Jefferson and basically says, look, you did everything you could as governor. You did a good job. What I think I would fault Jefferson for, and I think Jefferson in retrospect would fault himself, was when he fled to Poplar Forest rather than going to Stanton. Even though his term was technically up, and he had written a letter to the Speaker of the House of Delegates saying, look, he was eligible to be reappointed. He had only served for 2 terms. But he writes a letter saying, look, you need somebody with military experience, and that ain't me. I mean, say a lot of things about Jefferson. He was not a military man.
Mm-hmm.
And so he says, get somebody. He doesn't say Thomas Nelson Jr., but Thomas Nelson Jr. had led troops. He led the militia. Get a military man. But you have that hiatus before they can appoint Nelson, where it appears the government has no executive. Well, the government had no executive. And it appears that Jefferson has fled for his own personal safety because there was real concern. The Redcoats were going to follow the government over the mountains to Stanton. And so I do think he can be. And why did he do it? His wife is still alive at this point. She's very weak. She's been ill. We all know that she's going to die a year later from complications from childbirth. So yeah, he had personal reasons to go to Poplar Forest. But hindsight, and it is hindsight, certainly tells us that he should have gone to Stanton, allow them to appoint Thomas Nelson, and then go home. So I think he can be criticized for that.
All right, great. Well, I think that is a good spot to end it there, John. Thank you again for joining us, and for everyone online for tuning in to Red Hill Rediscovered. If you want to get your own copy, we do sell these at Red Hill. You can go online or call us to get your copy. And once again, John, thank you. I really enjoyed listening.
Cody, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.